Paris, January 21st, 1976. It was 12:40 p.m. local time in France. On the runway of the Charles de Gaulle International Airport, a plane was taking off into history. It was the first commercial flight of the first supersonic passenger aircraft ever made. Its destination, across the Atlantic Ocean, was Rio de Janeiro. Exactly at the same time and day, another plane of the same model was departing from London heading to Bahrain. It wasn't a coincidence. Air France and British Airways had agreed to simultaneously launch one of the greatest masterpieces ever created by humankind, the Concorde. The first aircraft to carry passengers at the speed of sound promised to usher in a new era for civil aviation. Expectations around the world were high, with people believing they were witnessing the beginning of a revolution in travel. The dream of a new, enduring phase where distances would shrink seemed more real than ever. Crossing the globe in a matter of hours seemed like a possibility that was finally within reach. However, things didn't quite turn out that way. Hope gave way to frustration. The Concorde lasted only a few decades before it was retired from service. And more than that, no other aircraft took its place. Today, there is no commercial aircraft capable of flying at supersonic speeds. It feels like planes have stalled in time. But why did this happen? Why did this incredible advancement come to a halt? To understand how humans managed to build an aircraft faster than the speed of sound, and why it ceased to exist, we need to go back to the very beginning of aviation history. The desire to fly has always captivated human imagination. The first recorded attempt to create a flying machine took place in ancient Greece nearly 2,500 years ago. The mathematician Archytas of Tarentum developed a prototype he called the pigeon. There aren't many details, but it is believed that it was an unmanned object, possibly propelled by compressed air, which flew for about 200 meters. In the following century, the Chinese created a flying object that you might still be familiar with today as a kite. It goes by many names: kite, flying lantern, or dragon kite, depending on the region. Over the centuries, various creative flying objects were developed, but none were suitable for transporting a human being. Then, in the 15th century, an inventor focused on creating a design that would finally allow humans to take flight. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. The Renaissance genius designed not one, but several flying machines. He was responsible for sketching the first designs of the helicopter, the parachute, and even an unusual contraption called the ornithopter, a type of airplane with wings that flap like a bird. Unfortunately, at the time, engineering and materials technology weren't advanced enough to bring these ideas to life or lift a human off the ground. But if these machines exist today, we owe some credit to Leonardo. And yes, all of these machines exist today, even the ornithopter. The pilot sits in a cabin, pressing a pedal that makes the wings flap gently. Admittedly, it doesn't fly more than 100 meters, but it's enough for a short journey while working on your leg muscles. Returning to our brief history of aviation, the first human flight happened in the 18th century in a very famous vehicle, the hot air balloon. The story began when the Montgolfier brothers in France noticed that a fire could inflate a silk sack. From there, they had an idea. In 1783, they launched the first manned balloon. The passengers were a sheep, a rooster, and a duck. Only after they saw that everything went well did they decide to send a human up in the balloon. And that's when Professor Jean-François Pilatre de Rogier entered history. The good news is that he became the first human to fly. The bad news is that he also became the first person to die in an aviation accident, but not on the inaugural flight. The first flight went perfectly fine. However, he got a bit too excited and decided to cross the English Channel by balloon, which separates France from England. And that's when things went wrong. In the following years, other flying machines were developed, such as the dirigible. It has a structure similar to a balloon, but it can have its flight directions controlled through motors and aerodynamic principles. However, the real revolution in the skies came with the airplane. As we know, it was invented by Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont. I say because in many parts of the world, this invention is credited to the Wright brothers from the United States. Rivalries aside, the debate over who deserves the title of father of aviation depends on how you define the first airplane flight. The Wright flyer, developed by the Wright brothers, indeed made its first flight in 1903. However, it relied on wind, tracks, or a catapult to take off. On the other hand, Santos Dumont's 14 bis made its first flight 3 years later, but with its own propulsion system. That's why, ultimately, the decision on who was the true father of aviation is up to each person's perspective. But Santos Dumont was certainly a key figure in aviation's history. Regardless, the 20th century marked the proliferation of airplanes. Technologies were advancing at an increasingly rapid pace, driven mainly by wars. The use of aircraft for military strategies, launching attacks, and spying on adversaries transformed the way battles were fought. And these battles, in turn, transformed how we flew. To give you an idea, before World War I, no aircraft could fly faster than 100 kilometers per hour. By the end of the war, many could reach speeds of 230 kilometers per hour. This change happened for a variety of reasons. Wood was replaced by aluminum, engines became more powerful, and airplanes grew larger, allowing more people on board. That's why, in the period between the wars, the first major airlines were established. Some of them still operate today, like Air France, KLM, and Lufthansa. The 1930s marked the golden age of aviation. Advances in aerodynamics led to the creation of more efficient aircraft. Navigation and communication technologies increased flight safety, and pressurized cabins allowed planes to fly higher, reducing turbulence and making air travel much smoother. Then, the world found itself again in the midst of a major war. Unfortunately, it was during the 1940s in World War II that aircraft were used to carry out one of the most brutal attacks in human history: the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. It is estimated that around 200,000 people died in the bombings, not to mention the long-term health impacts on millions more. On the other hand, World War II also accelerated the development of aircraft with many important innovations, such as the turbojet engine. In a turbojet engine, external air is drawn in, compressed, burned with fuel, and turned into gas, which is expelled at high speeds. This technology allowed aircraft to reach speeds of nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour. This was roughly the speed used for major commercial flights in the following years. But the desire to transport more people to more places faster led to new plans for the future. And so, in the 1960s, a more ambitious project was born. Businessmen, engineers, physicists, and many other professionals gathered to revolutionize science once again. The idea was to create an aircraft capable of flying faster than the speed of sound at around 1,200 kilometers per hour. It's important to note that, during this time, the Cold War divided the world into two blocks: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the socialist East, led by the Soviet Union. Both sides were competing for global dominance in politics, economics, and many other areas. Some of these competitions are well known, like the space race. But what many people don't know is that they were also competing in what we can call a supersonic race. While the Western Bloc was working on the Concorde, the Soviets were also developing their own supersonic project, the Tupolev Tu-144. Just like in the space race, the Soviets achieved a series of important victories, such as launching the first satellite and sending the first human into space. In the supersonic race, they also took an early lead. On June 5, 1969, during a test flight, the Tupolev became the first aircraft in history to break the sound barrier. The following year, it surpassed expectations, reaching speeds of up to 2,500 kilometers per hour, twice the speed of sound. So why does everyone still talk about the Concorde, while many have never even heard of the Tupolev? The Soviet aircraft faced many issues. In fact, its story began surrounded by controversy, with suspicions that the Soviets might have stolen designs from the Concorde, though this was never proven. But the Tupolev faced other much more serious problems. In 1973, before it entered commercial service, a demonstration flight ended in tragedy. The plane disintegrated in the air, killing all 6 occupants and another 8 people on the ground. The Soviets were never fully transparent about the investigation into the accident, but they acknowledged the need to make significant changes to the design. As a result, in the following years, the Tupolev was only used for cargo transport. There were just over 50 cargo flights before the Tupolev finally began transporting passengers. However, even the total number of passenger flights didn't exceed 50. This was due to the high cost of each flight and the extremely uncomfortable conditions. Passengers reported that the noise inside the aircraft was deafening, making it nearly impossible to hear the person sitting next to you. And that was just one of the problems with the Tupolev. In fact, there were officially 226 failures recorded over just 181 hours of flight. This made the aircraft's operation unsustainable, leading to the abandonment of the project in the 1970s. Meanwhile, its Western counterpart, the Concorde, had a very different journey. The project began in the early 1960s during a time when the American aerospace industry was booming. As a result, two European nations decided to join forces to boost their economies and compete with the United States. I'm talking about France and the United Kingdom. Each country had expertise in a specific area. The French were specialists in designing systems, while the British were experts in engine production. They teamed up to create a supersonic plane, and to mark their collaboration, they named the aircraft Concorde. But even then, the first issue arose. Should the name be in English, Concorde, or in French, Concorde? The disagreement was so intense, it nearly led to the cancellation of the project. In the end, the UK agreed to add the letter E at the end, claiming it represented England. Well, someone should have told them. Once that crucial issue was resolved, the engineers focused on the technological challenges of building such a fast plane. After all, at the speed of sound, air friction generates very high temperatures. So, the choice of materials had to be incredibly precise to prevent any parts from catching fire during flight. One of the major innovations was the fly-by-wire system. This technology is still used in most aircraft today. Thanks to it, the control of all the plane's moving parts is done using electrical impulses, rather than the springs and pulleys that were used in the past. All this investment in technology paid off when the Concorde took to the skies for the first time on March 2nd, 1969, without passengers on board. It took 7 years of testing before, in January 1976, the first Concordes carrying passengers took off, the same ones I mentioned at the beginning of the video. But these two Concordes were not the only ones. In total, 20 Concordes were produced, 6 prototypes, and 14 commercial aircraft operated by British Airways and Air France. One former CEO of the French company even called the Concorde the most beautiful object ever designed and built by man. At least that's what he said. But the fact is, flying on this plane was a fascinating experience. Well, I never had the chance, but those who did say the memories are unforgettable. The seats were a bit cramped, but the in-flight service was luxurious. The menu was crafted by top chefs and included dishes like lobster and caviar. The drinks were just as impressive, with vodka and champagne offered to passengers. But the biggest highlight was the speed. The plane had a screen visible to passengers, showing a kind of speedometer. The number would keep increasing until, at a certain moment, a flight attendant would announce the most anticipated moment. "Welcome aboard the supersonic flight." This announcement came at the precise moment the plane reached Mach 1, the speed of sound. This speed varies depending on altitude and other factors, such as air density, but on average, it's about 340 meters per second, or roughly 1,200 kilometers per hour. To give you an idea, the most traditional route for the Concorde between London and New York was completed in less than 3.5 hours. Considering the time zone difference of 5 hours between the two cities, this meant passengers arrived at their destination before the time of departure, taking local times into account. In other words, you could have lunch in London at noon, take the Concorde, and then have breakfast in New York at 10:30 a.m. Or perhaps even have dinner twice in the same night. The possibilities were endless. The Paris-Rio flight was also much faster than a conventional plane. While this route takes nearly 12 hours today, the Concorde completed it in only about 6 hours, including a refueling stop in Senegal. But if the flights were so fast, why did the Concorde come to an end? One of the first obstacles was its own speed. Whenever an object exceeds the speed of sound, it generates what's known as a sonic boom. The faster an object moves, the more compressed the sound waves it generates become. And when it surpasses the speed of sound, those waves combine into a powerful shockwave that travels at the speed of sound itself, creating a deafening noise. In the case of a supersonic aircraft, the sound is akin to an explosion, so loud that it could shake windows in the houses below. For this reason, supersonic flights were even banned for a while in the United States. The ban was later lifted, allowing the Concorde to fly over American airspace. However, this was not the Concorde's biggest problem. The main challenge was financial. The cost to operate such a fast aircraft was astronomical. In other words, flying on the Concorde was extremely expensive. Tickets cost over $10,000, far more expensive than first-class tickets on a conventional plane. Naturally, very few people could afford such a trip, making it difficult to fill the plane. You might ask, didn't they think about this when they designed the aircraft? The issue was that the cost of fuel was one price when the design began, but it became much more expensive by the time the Concorde started flying commercially, more than a decade later. This price increase came after the oil crisis, with international conflicts and geopolitical crises causing the price of oil to nearly triple in less than 10 years, significantly raising the cost of supersonic flights. Moreover, the Concorde consumed up to 25,000 liters of fuel per hour. By the 1980s and 90s, flying a supersonic plane became synonymous with financial losses for airlines. Then, in the early 2000s, two incidents sealed the fate of the Concorde. The first was a fatal crash in Paris in July 2000. A fire led to the crash of an Air France Concorde, killing all 109 people on board and another 4 on the ground. The model was grounded for over a year until safety modifications were implemented. The Concorde resumed flying in November 2001, when the aviation world had already been impacted by another tragedy, September 11th. In addition to causing a global aviation crisis, the attack on the World Trade Center had a surprising impact on the Concorde's operations. Many of the Concorde's frequent passengers worked in the Twin Towers. Businessmen and professionals who were among the few who could afford to use the Concorde to attend meetings in Europe. With their deaths, the demand for supersonic flights dropped. All these factors combined led to an inevitable conclusion. Tired of the losses, British Airways and Air France decided to retire the aircraft. On November 26, 2003, the Concorde landed for the last time in England. That marked the end of an aircraft that promised to forever change the course of air travel, but lasted less than 30 years. More than just the end of a plane, it was the end of an era in aviation. The century that witnessed the farewell of supersonic aircraft also saw the decline of giant airplanes. The so-called jumbos have also been losing space in the skies. A prime example is the Boeing 747-400, a colossus more than 70 meters long, capable of carrying up to 660 passengers. In recent years, Australian airline Qantas retired its fleet. British Airways also stopped using it for passenger transport. American Airlines have shifted to using the jumbo's cargo versions. Another major aircraft manufacturer, Airbus, has gone through a similar process with the A380. Lufthansa returned aircraft to the manufacturer, and Air France also retired the model. Meanwhile, Emirates replaced some of its orders with versions that have only 2 engines instead of 4. All of these decisions were made for one reason: economics. Jumbo jets are less fuel efficient and have higher maintenance costs. To turn a profit, airlines need to sell nearly every seat on each flight, which is not always easy. This is why airlines are currently focusing on smaller, more cost-effective aircraft, even though they take longer and may require more stops. It's no coincidence that the best-selling commercial airplane in the world to date is the Boeing 737. It may not be as fast or as large as other models that emerged in recent decades, but it has been the most widely used by airlines since its introduction in the 1960s. This also holds true for military aviation. The B-52 bomber, introduced in the 1950s, is expected to remain in service for several more decades, possibly even up to a century. Similarly, the F-16, launched 50 years ago, is still the most sought-after fighter jet by air forces worldwide. The weight and size of these aircraft are ideal for quick air combat maneuvers. Their reinforced structures can withstand up to 9 times the force of gravity, ensuring the safety of the pilots. The raised seat with a large glass canopy offers a perfect view of the surroundings, and the joystick-like control to the right of the cockpit, combined with the fly-by-wire system, has become a staple in military aviation. Additionally, the cost-to-benefit ratio of these models is considered unbeatable. It's simply not worth spending fortunes to replace aircraft that still function perfectly. It's the same idea as if it isn't broken, don't fix it. This gives us the feeling that airplanes have stagnated over time. But is that true? Well, perhaps we can consider it half true. After everything I've mentioned so far, it's clear why the aviation industry has opted not to continue investing in larger or faster airplanes. However, that doesn't mean nothing has changed in recent years. An example of this is the Eco Demonstrator, a Boeing project to test new technologies on flights without passengers before they are fully implemented. In recent years, dozens of innovations have been tested, such as a laser system to predict turbulence, wireless sensors to reduce the weight of aircraft, new coatings for wings to reduce ice and insect buildup, and even the use of biodiesel produced from sugarcane. These are just a few examples of the possibilities that the future holds for aviation. It's all quite exciting. But what about supersonic flights? Is there any hope that we might one day see, or even fly in, planes that exceed the speed of sound? The answer is yes. There are plans for a new supersonic plane in the coming years. I'm referring to the Overture, made by American manufacturer Boom Supersonic. It's still in the testing phase, with its first flight in March of this year, but it hasn't reached the speed of sound yet. Commercial flights are expected to begin around 2029. Some of the world's largest airlines, such as American, United, and Japan Airlines, have already ordered 130 units of the plane, which will carry up to 80 passengers. The Overture is expected to reach Mach 1.7, or 1.7 times the speed of sound, which is about 1,800 kilometers per hour. This would allow a flight from Miami to London, normally lasting about 10 hours, to be completed in just 5. To avoid the sonic boom I mentioned earlier, the Overture will fly at Mach 0.94, just below the speed of sound, while flying over land. It will only reach full speed when over the ocean. In terms of environmental impact, Boom Supersonic promises to move away from traditional jet fuel and use SAF, which stands for Sustainable Aviation Fuel. This fuel is made from renewable resources such as vegetable oils, animal fats, and organic waste. The big challenge that still remains is the economic viability of the project, as this was the primary obstacle for the Concorde. Personally, I'm very curious about what flying on the Overture will be like, but I'd rather not think about how expensive the tickets will be. For now, all we can do is wait and watch as this incredible journey towards supersonic flight unfolds, not just here on Earth, but in space as well. After all, in addition to the race for high-speed travel in airplanes, airlines are also increasingly dedicating themselves to space exploration. This year, Boeing launched its first flight to the International Space Station in partnership with NASA. By doing so, they joined a growing group of companies and organizations pushing the boundaries of space exploration in recent years. It's also worth noting that over the next decade, we'll witness not only the return of supersonic flights, but also, as I've mentioned here on the channel, the return of humans to the moon. Plus, the creation of a lunar base that will eventually enable us to achieve the long-awaited conquest of Mars. These projects show us that as important as it is to go fast, it's equally important to go far. They also remind us that in humanity's insatiable quest for new horizons, not even the sky is the limit. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next video.